Today's episode is once again an effort to combine a concept that's already been articulated, in this case in a Medium post, with the medium of video, of YouTube, to hopefully elucidate the concept more effectively. This concept is sovereignty, and of course I'll go into some detail about what I mean by that in a moment. For those of you who want to delve more deeply into that concept, I'll include a link to the Medium post below. So the idea is that we can reconceptualize this concept of sovereignty using a new framework. And the point is that I think that this new framework is a good, deep way of anchoring sovereignty in a more foundational fashion that is appropriate to the set of problems that we face today. And in point of fact, I use this concept often and will probably quite likely refer to it in other videos. So it's effectively a triadic structure. The notion is there's three distinct underlying capacities that are associated with to be sovereign. And also that your sovereignty then represents a sort of general purpose capacity to respond to the world. So that's the simplest sense of what it means. So to say that you are sovereign is to say that within a certain context and in a certain set of circumstances, you have the capacity to take responsibility for your circumstances, to respond to the environment that you're in, as opposed to, say, be overwhelmed by it or to merely react to it, etc. So this is the core notion. But we can actually decompose that and then reconfigure it and bring it back together in a way that I think is very powerful and very timely in the contemporary environment. For those of you who are familiar with Boyds OODA loop, which is 4 points, observe, orient, decide, act, you can kind of imagine the three that I'm describing as being the blank space in between, and maybe I'll reference that as we go through it. So the first aspect of sovereignty is perception, the capacity to receive information from your environment. And this particular capacity has three primary characteristics. One you might think of as being the modalities of perception. So for example, vision is a different modality than smell, which is a different modality than hearing. And this distinction of modality is very important because different modalities of perception have very different qualities. There are things that you can see that you cannot hear, and things that you can hear that you cannot see, no matter how much acuity your vision or your hearing happen to have. And the fact that the reality happens to be partitioned in that way is actually quite interesting. But in any event, modality and the number of modalities with which you go about perceiving is a fundamental characteristic of your underlying capacity of perception. Another one, though, is bandwidth. So bandwidth has to do with the amount of information flow you can actually receive through a given modality. So this is both in terms of the continuum of the total possibilities. So within the electromagnetic spectrum, for example, what portion of that spectrum can you see? And then also the velocity, the actual amount of information flow that's coming at you that you can process effectively, at least through your perceptual lens. And then the last characteristic is subtlety or discernment in perception. And this has to do with the ability to not just perceive kind of raw bandwidth, maybe a little bit of the distinction between, say, a telescope and a microscope, that where a telescope has a capacity to have subtlety in the direction of distance, a microscope has the capacity to have subtlety in the direction of the very small. And so those are obviously two very, very different capacities within what may be the same bandwidth and the same modality of vision. And then all of this perception is in the context of overwhelm, because while your instruments of perception have certain capacities to perceive, they also have certain thresholds after which the capacity itself is degraded. So you've got sort of an upper limit of what you can perceive, but then you also have a degree to which signals outside of that limit actually degrade the capacity. So if you listen to a loud noise, you then lose your hearing capacity for some period of time, or a flash of light makes it harder to see for some period of time. And so to the degree to which you are able to increase modality, increase bandwidth, increase subtlety, and increase your capacity to perceive without being overwhelmed, you then increase this dimension of sovereignty, the perception dimension of sovereignty. And then you have the second dimension, which is the dimension perhaps of processing or intelligence. And the handoff between the two is the dimension of sense making. And so in this second category, we're talking about our ability to take perception and to convert it into meaning. And again, this has a number of characteristics. You have things like your raw processing speed. How much information can you take in and convert? It may be that you're getting overwhelmed at the level of intelligence, not at the level of perception. But also other things that map a little bit to modality and bandwidth and subtlety. For example, your capacity to develop frameworks of abstraction so that you can actually take large amounts of raw information and decompose it into structures and patterns and models. Your modeling capacity is a component of intelligence or processing. And then pattern recognition, your ability to notice and detect patterns, which you then compress and use as objects that you can plug into your models. Right? So these are all aspects of intelligence. And now it's also important to recognize the feedback between the two modes, or the two domains. So you have, for example, if you have a hearing and a vision modality of perception, you're going to need to have a hearing and vision processing capacity. And then also, broadly speaking, you'll need to have a binding capacity, which is to compare the inputs from those two different modes and convert them into some bound model of the reality in which you're operating that takes advantage of the parallax of comparison. And then the other side of the intelligence capacity is going from making sense of your environment to making meaning of your environment, or to making choices. And this is, in the Boyd model, this is the decide side of the equation. So here, what's happening is you're now comparing the input, what the environment is telling you, what's going on, to possible outputs. And this, of course, is largely both modeling your own state, what's your portfolio of possible actions, what can you do viably, and then sort of a sense of what might be effective in your environment, strategy and planning. And then this boundary condition then connects to the third capacity, which is, properly speaking, your capacity to actually act, your agentic capacity per se. So this is going to include the portfolio of actions that you have available to you. Can you walk? Can you talk? Can you write software code? The efficiency with which you can project your will into the world, meaning what's the ratio of effect to energy? Is it very, very difficult? Do you spend a lot of energy getting a small effect, or can you deliver on the effect that you desire with a very small amount of energy? But also, for example, the ability to avoid unintended consequences. Are you a bull in a china shop? Are you delivering on what you want, but also delivering a whole lot of things that you don't want? And the combination of these different characteristics. And so that sum total ends up being your action capacity, or your agentic portion of this triad. So you have perception, you have intelligence, and you have agency. And notice that while the primary flow, or the dominant flow, is from perception through to agency, and then, of course, it goes into the environment. You do stuff, and it causes the environment to change in some way, and then you perceive what happens, and you're on your loop, which is now both the Boyd OODA loop and the sovereignty loop in the way that I'm describing it now. Also notice that it goes the other way, that we, at least, and I think most sentient creatures, will have a dispositional attitude. So, for example, if you are disposed towards being in a fight, let's say, for example, you've already perceived that you may be in a fight, and your body is now prepared to be in a fight, you're actually feeding back from your action potential into your choice-making and meaning-making all the way down to perception. So you'll actually be potentially more likely to perceive threats and less likely to perceive things that are non-threats, because your dispositional attitude at the action level is actually feeding back into the circle. So there's forward and backwards loops in sovereignty. Okay, so that's the framework at a theoretical level. And so notice a couple of things. One is, we can speak about sovereignty now as almost, not as almost, as a capacity, which means that there's a continuum. You can have a certain level of sovereignty. It'll have certain qualities. And this will measure your ability to respond to your environment. So I may be sovereign now under the conditions that I'm in, and under the sort of sets of things to which I must respond. But I might find myself not sovereign. Something may have come that is outside of my perceptual capacity, or I might have been overwhelmed and had my overall capacity degraded. The second thing is that we can notice how this concept relates to some of the other things that are going on in the broader world. So a hypothesis or a heuristic might be that one should always only act in one of two ways. Either within the scope of your sovereignty, or to upgrade or improve your sovereignty itself. Right? So if you find yourself faced with a potential problem, some task, some challenge, either you are up to the challenge, your sovereignty is able to respond to what's happening, or you should actually focus first and foremost on getting your sovereignty up to the task. Which means, for example, that as a heuristic, if you're faced with a challenge that is outside of the scope of your sovereignty, venturing into that challenge is only a worst case scenario choice. What you should instead do is improve or increase your sovereignty so that then you're able to respond to your environment. And then a simple example here might be, say, like in a sporting event. If you don't know how to shoot an arrow at all, you're not going to do very well in an archery competition. And so then rather than just sort of wildly shooting and missing, the right response is just to upgrade your capacity, become more skillful in that particular endeavor. And we can extend this broadly. So, for example, Jordan Peterson, I would say, and I do say in this Medium post, is in many ways just pointing this fact out, that sovereignty is the place from which you have the ability to be responsible. And you have an obligation to be responsible for what you can be responsible for, but it's actually, in fact, foolishness to endeavor to be responsible outside of your ability to respond. So, first and foremost, figure out what your sovereignty is. So, begin in the middle, begin in the center, begin with you. Clean your room. If you can't take care of something like that, then what makes you think that you are prepared to take care of something even more complex? So start with yourself. Get yourself sorted out. Get yourself in a space of self-sovereignty and build things like awareness of your capacities and how your capacities are operating now. Am I overwhelmed? Am I working effectively? Am I in flow around the loop? And then build learning, raw learning, like build the ability to build capacity. Then build discernment, which is the relationships between the capacity components and how to actually notice where you are in relationship to your capacity to learn and your capacity then finally to respond. And as you have gone through that process, as you've actually mastered sovereignty itself, then you are in fact optimally positioned to go out into the world and to begin to address more broad and maybe more significant or more, in principle, meaningful challenges. So that's it. That's this particular concept. I will, in fact, likely be referring to some subcomponents of this concept in the future. So if it doesn't make sense, it might be a good idea to take a look at the Medium post. Maybe writing is something over which you have more sovereignty. It's a better perceptual modality. And of course, I've spent more time on it than this video, which I, once again, have done off the top of my head. By the way, for those of you who've been noting that you'd like to see an improvement in the audio quality, I went ahead and made an investment and bought this Elvis-style microphone. So I hope the audio quality is up to standard. If it is, I'll get a stand so I don't have to hold it Elvis style. And I may eventually upgrade my recording capacity in general.